Okay, welcome everyone. It's exciting to see so many people come out for this really exciting conversation. My name is Chris. I'm part of the Sustainable Economies Law Center. And as Ricardo mentioned, we host these kinds of community conversations and teach-ins as part of the Resilient Communities Legal Cafe. So tonight's conversation about strategies for democratizing urban land use is actually building off of a community forum that was a collaborative effort of a range of community-based organizations here in Oakland that were exploring community-led responses to gentrification. That is obviously a really potent issue here in the Bay these days. And the Sustainable Economies Law Center is wanting to get more involved around issues of housing and access to land. So one of the goals or the aspirations of tonight for SELC is to gather some input from various community members and experts in various parts of this conversation about policy interventions and practices that can happen at the local and regional level to build resilience in the context of rising land costs and gentrification. So that is part of the context of this conversation. That being said, I'd also like to welcome us into the space by acknowledging where we are. And I mentioned this earlier, so I hope it doesn't come out of the blue, but I'd love for you to welcome us to the land itself and a kind of acknowledgement of whose land we're on. Would you be willing to do something like that?
Well, for those of you who don't know, and you probably all do, the land that we are now on is Ohlone land. The Ohlone people were the people who occupied this land around San Francisco Bay, going back some 10,000 years. And so I'm half Ohlone. And take great pride. When people ask me, am I from the neighborhood? I said, yes, my people have been here for 10,000 years. But I'm really from San Jose. So in any case, on behalf of the ancestors, welcome to this land and welcome to this place. And I'm sure if you are getting to know or have been here for a while, you appreciate the beauty and the richness of this Bay Area, which our people have been able to enjoy, were able to enjoy for many, many centuries.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And this is Hank Herrera, who will be one of our special hosts this evening, speaking about the Sacred Community Land Trust and other ways that he's involved in this question. And this is Carl Fitzgerald, all the way from Australia. He's come to speak to us about the global context of gentrification, as well as some on-the-ground case studies that are happening in Australia. So we have two really amazing speakers who are speaking to this issue in a very local context and in the global context, because I don't think we can have this conversation without putting it in the larger context. So we're gonna have a chance to hear from both of these folks for about 20 to 30 minutes each, and then we hope to have time for more of a conversation to get some input from everyone that's gathered here. So before I turn the mic over to Hank, I kind of wanted to share this attempt at 400 years of land enclosures in the US. I just started drawing this earlier today, so it's a bit of an experiment. But basically, what is the historical context of this conversation? So we're talking about from ownership to stewardship, right? So it's important to acknowledge what traditions exist. Cultures that have come from a place of stewardship, a steward relationship with land, which include, of course, the native peoples of this continent, as well as other continents. African tribes held land in common, where the people who used the land were the ones who had right to it. That's also found in Mongolian grasslands, for example, where they found that because the land was held in common, the degradation to the land was much less than when the same lands were shifted to private ownership or to state-run grazing lands. And we also have examples, other parts of the continent, the Mexican ejidos, or similar land held in common. To those who use the land, they have the rights. So as you may be able to see here on the bottom of this sort of timeline is various dynamics that are taking place both around the enslavement of people and the economy that grew out of the slave trade, as well as the several century-long process of land grabbing, essentially, that took place as European descendants spread west across this continent. So the state was giving land basically to railroad companies, to other corporations, to speculators. And what you see on the far end is at this point in time, 80% of the population live on 3% of land in the US. The rest of that land is either owned by the government. A third of the land is basically owned by the state, and the remainder is owned by corporations and private landowners. So 3% of the land and only 7% of the wealth generated in the US, like 80% of the people. So basically two things happening, land and wealth, right? Wealth being measured by not just income, but all the other various financial assets and home ownership is, being measured by wealth. But on the top, we also have sort of counter movements going on. In the mid-1800s, there was a free soil movement that was seeking to give land to settlers, basically, who worked the land. You have Homestead Acts following the Civil War, and a man we'll probably hear more about, Henry George, who was a great advocate of the free land movement. And we'll hear more about as well as the community land trust as a mechanism for holding land in perpetuity by the community, which actually evolved first in the US in the 1960s in Georgia as a way of giving more access to land to African American sharecroppers, essentially. And here we are today, just after the subprime mortgage crisis, which was called by at least one organization the greatest stealing of wealth in the history of the US. Basically, the likelihood of people of color having subprime mortgages is about 3 times higher than for white families. So what we saw was a massive transfer of wealth through mortgages and home ownership transferred up through banks and to essentially the 1%. So we're dealing with some heavy issues here, of course, but what we really want to do is now, a 2-minute history of land enclosures in the US is to really focus on what some solutions might be, both at the local level and in a global context. So all that said, I'm going to turn it over to Hank to share a bit more about what's happening here in Oakland.
Well, I think Chris said we had 20 minutes to 30 minutes to talk a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'll take full advantage of my time and start my story with where I first got involved with Community Land Trust, which was in Rochester, New York, where I was living, and where I got involved with the lowest income census tracts in 15 county area, part of the inner city of Rochester, called Northeast Rochester, a community that was predominantly, or is predominantly African American and Puerto Rican. And my entry into that community came about because I got involved with a group of activists that were advocating for a grocery store in the community. The last grocery store that the community had burned down, and a group of us wanted to get a new grocery store, a new supermarket into the community. So that's a long story. It's a separate story. This was in the years before people, or at the time, people were just beginning to recognize how supermarkets were leaving communities of color and trying to find solutions. And over a 6-year period of time, we succeeded in getting a brand new supermarket into the community. But in the meantime, during that 6 years, I got involved with neighborhood organizations and helped to develop a neighborhood organization focused on neighborhood economic development. And we began to address issues like property values and the potential for gentrification in the community and the displacement of traditional or historical residents, and how could we begin to deal with that. We started market gardens, and we actually acquired a piece of land that had been farmland and never had been built on, right in the heart of the neighborhood. It's a very magical place. And we turned it into an urban farm. But we needed a mechanism to hold the land and protect land from speculation and from acquisition by outside interests, and, as I said, from gentrification. So somewhere along the line, I don't know where, I heard about community land trusts and started to try to understand this mechanism for land tenure, and came across the Institute for Community Economics and learned about their programs. And I was intrigued because, among other dimensions of community land trust, is the dimension of the commons, which resonates with me culturally. I have, as I explained earlier, Native heritage and a heavy influence from Chicano culture, Latino culture, and I'm particularly intrigued by this beautiful place called New Mexico, if you've ever been there, the land of enchantment, where for generations people had nurtured and stewarded the commons, held land in commons where people could graze and grow food, et cetera, et cetera. There were not systems of property ownership. And I thought, well, let's see, how do we bring the commons to this very particular place in Rochester, New York, where we needed to protect the land and protect it from speculation and protect it from rising land prices. So as I learned about community land trusts, you know, a key element of a community land trust, how many of you know about community land trusts? Maybe I'm talking to everybody already knows. So a lot of you already know. So you can help me out. If I get it wrong, you can correct me. But a key feature of a community land trust is that the land trust is a legal entity that owns the land and leases the land through a ground lease, often a 99-year ground lease, to someone who owns a building on top of the land, on the land, an improvement, so-called improvement. And there are elements of the lease that ensure that the person who owns the improvement on the land cannot, if the person chooses to leave and sell the improvement, the person cannot exceed a certain percentage of profit on the investment that person has made. So, for example, you know, 5% is often a figure. It's in that range. If you lease a piece of land in a land trust and you build a house that's worth $100,000, well, that's a fantasy anymore. But let's just say that for round numbers. And you want to sell the house after a certain period of time, you can't sell it for more than $105,000. And the land trust has the right of first refusal to buy the land, so that if there's, I'm sorry, buy the house, excuse me, the improvement, correct. so if there's not a buyer and you need to leave, then the land trust has the right to buy the property back, the improvement back. And the prices don't go up in the same way as they would if there were a housing boom and you could sell it for twice of what your investment was. So this all seemed pretty intriguing, and so we created a land trust for this neighborhood, the Northeast neighborhood of Rochester, and was called the Northeast Neighborhood Alliance Land Corporation, because we didn't want to go through the process of the legal process of being called a trust, which means banking, and so that would have been a little bit of a hassle. In any case, we placed into the land trust our farm and other property that we acquired in the public market. And before I left there, the goal was to begin to acquire residential property and put that land in the land trust. And then the improvements on that land would be controlled by the rules of the land trust to stay affordable. So fast forward to, I moved to Oakland, back to California in 2007, and in that same year, I was at a meeting of the Community Food Security Coalition, which took place in Vancouver, and the opening plenary talk was by a Native woman from Canada, a First Nations person, who was talking about the development that was going on of a mountain for the Olympics, that was the Winter Olympics that were going to take place in Vancouver the next year, and how that mountain was sacred to her people, and it was traditional land for acquiring food, and it was going to be taken from them and destroyed for the sake of ski lifts and other amenities for the Olympics. And it got me to thinking about how land is sacred and community is sacred. And we should have ways of not destroying what is sacred. We should have ways of protecting sacred land and sacred communities, our own sacred beings. So it came to the notion of creating something called the Sacred Community Land Trust that would represent that idea of a sacred land and sacred community. And but at this point, I was moving on from doing housing, and I was interested in conservation of farmland, because being in the sustainable agriculture and the community food security movements, we needed to find ways to acquire and conserve prime farmland so that young farmers and people who wanted to farm affordably could acquire land affordably and build their farms on that land. And I had learned about the formation of something called Equity Trust, which was founded by Chuck Matai, one of the key people in the Institute for Community Economics, and before he passed on. And they do that. They provide technical support and financing for farmland acquisition and placement in a community land trust for farming. So with some friends here in Oakland, some years ago, we formed the Sacred Community Land Trust. It's a legal corporation under the laws of the state of California. It's a nonprofit. And we went through a fairly long conversation with the IRS, and we finally have gotten our designation as a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. We don't have any land in our trust yet, but the goal is to identify property and potentially landowners who are willing to place conservation easements on the land, and then the land trust holds the easement and ensures that the terms of the easement are kept. And as you may know already, if you own 100 acres of farmland and you want to keep 5 acres for your family, you can designate the other 95 acres for the easement, and 5 acres is still yours and you live there and do whatever you want. But the 95 acres has to be managed under the terms of the easement. And something I learned is that in land trusts, the person who gives the easement also gives the land trust the money to manage the easement over time, usually. So we're talking about people who have a fair amount of wealth that they can afford to both place the land in the conservation easement and also fund for the management of it. So we haven't struck that kind of deal with anybody yet, but that's the purpose of the Sacred Community Land Trust, and we're hopeful that we can acquire local land, put it in land trust. It could be urban, it could be rural, and then once the land is under an easement, it can be held for and kept for farming, and we have the authority to lease the land to low-income farmers and ranchers, so they have a chance to get started with farming and with affordable access to land. So that's my story.
Wonderful.
Right
Yeah,
now.
and I think two of the really key points there is that the land trust can both preserve the affordability of land and housing, and also ensures the specific use of the land, which is determined by the community. So increasingly we're seeing land trusts enter the urban ag scene to ensure long-term access to urban farmers, because land tenure is perhaps the #1 issue or challenge that's faced by urban farming today, particularly as that movement grows alongside increasing land values. So on the subject of increasing land values, that's probably a good segue to Carl's talk. So if you wanted to introduce yourself a bit more and about what your trip to this part of the world is about as well.
Yep.
That'd be great.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm very honoured to be here amongst you. We always look to American activism as keeping the pressure on. So whilst we're all under the pump around the world, in Australia, the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, the Koch brothers, they filter through. So for me as an activist, it started in Indigenous activism through what we called the Stolen Wealth Games under Uncle Robbie Thorpe, and there was a program there called the Black GST, and it was representing genocide, moving towards sovereignty, and then pushing for the signing of the treaty. And so that happened for 60 days. We held some land in the centre of Melbourne. We held a sacred fire, and a lot of Indigenous people got to reconnect with their culture, and a lot of us whiteys, us Gubba folk, got to enjoy a smoking ceremony for the first time. So this is a 60,000-year-old culture that's under persecution, and wherever we look around the world, any culture that has an inherent understanding of just how valuable the Earth's resources are is generally under threat. And that sort of divide and conquer mentality filters all the way through into the economic sphere, which is what I am as an economist. I work for Prosper Australia, who is funded by the Henry George Foundation of Australia. Henry George, of course, was quite a notable figure here in San Francisco, having written the book Progress and Poverty in 1879. I'm lucky to be staying with Dave Geeson from thecommons.sf, who's here in the room, an absolute walking dictionary on this topic if you want to get your head around how those who own the earth have this incredible advantage over anyone trying to run a business or earn a wage. And that's the bare basics of it. And the tax system was the way to recalibrate these natural advantages and encourage productive use of our time rather than this speculative largesse which is tearing the world apart. And it was interesting to see you mention Mongolian grasslands. Well, we've got a huge mining boom going on in Mongolia, and the land bubble that surrounds a mining boom is just astronomical. Something like 20% plus a year. The property prices are going up with the rents. And one of the things I do is a podcast called The Renegade Economists, recording it for this, so hello listeners. And yeah, people around the world are very interested in hearing how this global property bubble is playing out. So there they are in Mongolia, some 40% over 2 years. In Delhi, it's around about 60% over 2 years. In India's capital, just storming through there. In China, it's taken just 30 years to get to a 3-generation mortgage. 3 generations. And so all around the world, what we're seeing is the banks are expanding the length of mortgage tenure. So in Australia, it's now snuck up to 40 to 50 years. And within that, in the 80s, investors were some 12% of the market. Now they're at 40% and pushing that. Add the cash purchases that are coming in from around the world, and that's maybe 45 plus. But we're seeing this incredible concentration of capital that's circling the world at a rapid pace. We've got pension funds, superannuation funds, we've got private equity. You know, the 1%ers are well and truly set up. And I've been very happy to see here in California that there's at least a recognition that when infrastructure is built, when a community garden is operating in a community, that makes that location more valuable. And so in LA, they're redoing the LA River, and already the speculators are in there buying up the land and waiting for this new infrastructure to be completed so they can enjoy their 15-20% return with nothing more than a bit of paperwork to sign and, of course, some incredible wealth to begin with. So that's the basis of the pyramid system we live within. And to be able to draw that distinction between land and capital is a really big point if we're going to critique this system we're sitting under. So land, of course, is a gift from the Creator, and it represents all natural resources, from the water, the minerals, to the electromagnetic spectrum. It represents the earth. And unfortunately, in the 1880s, just 7 years after Henry George released Progress and Poverty, the American Economics Association was established. And this headhunted the leading economists in America to design an economic system that removed the earth from our primary function. And so the production function, how we calculate GDP, used to be applied labour onto land makes capital, and the 3 of those things produce our GDP, our output. Now, unfortunately, these guys got away with it, and they hid land in as a subset of capital. And where that flows is in terms of the policy priorities governments set. And you always hear them worrying about inflation and unemployment. They've got to keep inflation low, look after the wealthy savings. They've got to keep unemployment low, stop the riots on the streets. Here in America, you're very lucky that, well, I don't know if you're lucky or not, but it's pretty handy having such subsidies for your farmers that leads to such cheap food. Because in Australia, the price of food is just rocketing up as these greater and greater concentrations of supermarket chains keep merging. And I think there's 2 chains in Australia that control about 80% of our supermarkets. So whatever you do, see if you can help those local independent grocers, because that's the sort of competition we should be having. But through society, there's always this push to agglomerate these powers that be. So, yeah, once we recognize that the earth is unique, it will naturally increase in value. A couple of technical terms you might like to take note of is that the rise in value of land is called an unearned income. A windfall gain is another euphemism, but most technically it's known as economic rent. And when I went and spoke in Vanuatu, where unfortunately in just 15 to 20 years, 90% of their main island of Afate has been privatised and sold off. And the Australian property developers who have gone through have used ludicrous names like Barrier Beach. Can you imagine coming up with a term called Barrier Beach, building a fence in front of it, and then complaining when the local Nivan people can't get to the water anymore to fish so they can look after themselves, and they end up on the edge of this barrier begging? I mean, that's what land privatisation has done, creating these barriers, and it's the start of the push towards slums, towards dependence on the state and the removal of our own independent selves. So that, you know, our macro vision, our utopia is to actually, there's so much money in these natural resources and other monopolies that if the people really wanted to, we could remove all taxes on food and on income. We could even go further and remove them off companies and say, look, we'll give you that. There's already so many tax loopholes, you're already hiding your money all around the world. Let's just switch it all onto these monopoly functions of land and utilities, telephones, all of these sort of main monopolies. And in Australia, we're very lucky to still have some good statistics left. So I've written a report called The Total Resource Rents of Australia, which quantifies just how big the free lunch is. And we all hear about the free lunch, no such thing as a free lunch. And if you look in the economics textbooks, they say it's only 1%, forget about it, don't even look at it. Well, when I quantified it up through these 23 different monopolies, it came up to 23.6% of our GDP. So nearly a quarter of the economy is a free lunch where people don't have to actually work. All they need is money to own one of these monopoly type resources. And of that 23.6, 14.2% was the land component. And in Australia, to run all three levels of government, we need $390 billion. In 2011-12, that's what we needed, $390 billion. In just the 3 months, the December quarter of 2013, land values went up $184 billion in 3 months. So what we're saying is we could, if we wanted to, have a system where we tax away this profit in land. And from that, it keeps a lid on the land price, knocks that off. And so by doing that, we have less debt. We can redirect this property bubble into financing government, and by doing that, we can reduce income tax. And when you place this this land tax in, and you start making these landowners pay perhaps, you know, $10,000, $15,000 a year, all of a sudden, all of these dead zones we see around cities, these vacant blocks, they have to go on the market. And we urgently need to have infill occurring around our cities. They're hidden everywhere, but if you're a cyclist and you really, you know, have a look near your train station, I bet you'll be able to see 1 or 2 empty blocks of land. And these add up. And in Australia, and what I've seen around the world, is that the real estate industry very quickly tries to own that turf over who decides what a vacant property is. So we in Australia came up with water consumption as a proxy for vacant land and housing. So a single person uses 176 litres of water a day. Maybe it's less here, I don't know, but that's what our figures are. And we found that a leaking tap can leak over 70 plus litres a day. And so we said, well, let's use 50 litres as, you know, a happy medium, just be a bit conservative. And we found some 60,000 empty properties in Melbourne, and none of those were included in the Real Estate Institute's vacancy figures. What would that do for housing affordability if these vacant properties came on the market and pushed the prices down? So when those prices come down, when you get rid of company tax and all this other tax paperwork, all of a sudden there'll be more small business starting up. So that's the sort of basis of Georgism, is we can make things easier by redirecting this rising value of the earth as a natural system of financing government. But because we live in a system of lobbyocracy, where one vote, one value's been replaced by $1 for one decision virtually, it's such a hypocrisy, drives me crazy. I bet it does you guys too. But community land trusts are the micro vision of this macro utopia we push for, and Hank did a really good job summarising his trail of discovery in looking at these land trusts, and it's surprising they're not more well known throughout the community. And maybe one of those reasons, in Australia at least, and the one I'm going to discuss with you now, is because really it's kind of to their advantage to keep quiet. And so there's one, I don't know if you know of Byron Bay in Australia. It's sort of our main hippie area on the mid-Australian east coast, above, in between Sydney and Brisbane. But inland from Byron Bay is Nimbin, and that is, the streets there smell a lot like San Francisco's. But there's a lot of free thinkers there, and one of the trustees to our organisation, he's a fantastic guy, David Spain, and he's been involved since the formation of Turntable Falls, and they've been around now for 40 years, and they're Australia's oldest intentional community. And they do some very interesting things there, and one of the points that I find interesting with land trusts is how you can have a system where it's revenue positive for both the trust member who's living on the land and the land trust itself. And from what I've seen with a lot of the resale formulas, and it becomes very hard for the trust itself to have a strong financial base so they can keep growing and expanding the affordable housing they're providing for people. But Turntable Falls, how they do it is no one can own any land, and you have to have live there for 12 months before you get even a chance to become a member. You have to have attended 6 out of 10 of their tribal meetings, they're called. And after a year, and you put your name forward to become a member, you have to have 10 people speak up for you. And 6 of those 10 have to be positive. So it's not encouraging a total a yes men mentality. People are allowed to critique you, but it's an interesting way to encourage transparency. And then once you've got your membership, you can speak to the housing committee about where you want to set up in the hamlet zone within, I think, these 200 acres they bought in the early 70s. And we had, like your Woodstock, we had the Age of Aquarius festival in Australia. And a lot of these people went and set up this Turntable Falls. So you get approval to be in the hamlet area, and you have to plant a flag, and everyone has to see that for a set amount of time. And enough time for people to resonate and feel how's that going to impact their view on the community, how's it going to fit in with the aesthetics, you know, the local, the dirt road over there and all those sort of things. And yeah, there's a whole pile of bylaws they've set in place so that you have a grey water system and composting in place, all those sort of usual things that happen. But one of the interesting things is that you can't own the land, you can only own the improvements, and you have to pay a yearly fee to the Turntable Falls Trust of around about $1,200. So there's about 200 families living there. So they've got $240,000 each year coming through their community. They owe about $150,000 to the local council for all of the council services, such as maintaining the roads and the rubbish and the library and all those good things that our local property taxes cover. So they've got around about $80,000 or $90,000 to invest in their local community. And from that, they've apparently got a $4 million community neighbourhood house where they have their meetings, and it's got all the facilities you could think of. So when you just think of having 200 families together and all paying a set amount that's fair and reasonable, and what you can do with that money, keeping it within your boundaries rather than it leaking out into the banking sphere, which is largely what happens now. It's a great tragedy that not more of this is going on. But there's a number of different formulas that I'm aware of with community land trusts in terms of how you have the resale of property. And this is the thing I really wanted to bring to tonight's conversation. Because you can, as Hank said, have it, your property based on the, I think you said the median value of the house in the area?
No, it was the way we did it in Rochester was a percentage of whatever the improvement cost was. You couldn't exceed a certain amount. You couldn't speculate beyond that certain amount. So.
Well, that sounds more sensible than the ones I've heard where you're only allowed to sell at 60% of the median house value in that community, outside the trust, but in the wider community. And for me, that allows too much of the land price to be included in the sale price. And this is one of the complexities. In Australia, they call it a housing bubble, but as you know, as soon as your house is built, it starts falling apart. So the houses depreciate, and it's the location, the land value that increases. So we have good figures that say it's somewhere between 65 to 70% of every mortgage is the land component. So it's a huge amount that we're paying interest on to the banksters. You know, we need to close that loop so we can drop that mortgage pain on the community and keep some of that money within our immediate community to do the things we need to do. So that 60% is a it's a bit hard. It's a hard one because it allows that land price, and then for the trust themselves, they only get a minor body corporate fee, which I've seen, you know, is $10 a month for some land trusts. And so they're going to get nowhere quickly with that sort of revenue stream. They're going to have to put their hands out all the time to try and get the money to bring it in. So on the long-term average, Australian land prices have increased by about 6% a year. So that's essentially saying the economic rents, the naturally rising value of the earth, is about 6% when it comes to residential land itself. So the formula I came up with a colleague of mine in Melbourne, Gavin Putland, was that, well, we can't take all the 6% at once, which is ultimately what Georges would like, but let's go halfway and let's just see if this land trust could operate with a 3% land rent. And by calculating that people generally move house every 7 to 10 years, when you did sell your house, you would pay a 50% capital gains tax on the improvements themselves. So what that would do is basically capture most of that rent, and the 3% land rent would go to the trust and help them pay off the money they have invested in this trust. Now there's one other interesting development that you should be aware of, and that's what a guy named Colin Cook in the UK has been doing, and he has approached the Norwegian pension fund for finance. And there's a growing movement amongst ethical investment type superannuation companies or pension funds, various private ancillary trust funds that are out there who are trying to do the right thing and want to invest in green, affordable housing with all those bells and whistles that they can advertise to their supporters over. So the Norwegian pension fund has lent him a CPI indexed loan for 30 years. So that means instead of charging them 6%, generally inflation's around about 3%. Record lows at the moment. So they're getting a very cheap, basically cost-priced loan, which gives them a huge advantage when running and operating their trust. So I would certainly encourage you to have a look for these big pension funds that have an ethical base and see if they would be interested in investing in a land trust. But even on a half-acre block, the figures we've done, preliminary figures we've done, with some 20 to 25 apartments, multi-density. There's still plenty of room to have your good community gardens, your bike parking, your solar panels, your wind turbines, all those things. Very quickly, within 5 to 6 years, the land trust can pay off the millions of dollars needed to get this project up and running. So it's an exciting space, and something I wish I could spend more time on, but goodness me, we're being assaulted left, right and centre, aren't we? But we need some good solid land to plant our feet in the ground and call home. So let's hope that some of these discussions tonight help move us forward.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both. Let me just thank you both for the knowledge and so with that, I'm sure there are both some questions and some insights. I know there's a lot of wisdom in this circle already. So we have a solid 30 minutes to just have more of a conversation now that we've talked at you for a while. So I'd love to open the floor up, both questions to either of these gentlemen or questions to each other, or other exciting examples of ways to address this this massive question of access to land. Yeah, see.
I just had a question. Speak loudly, please. A question to Carl about the trust that you talked about and the cost to the people who live there. It appears that they must all be decently employed people with income to make the payments, yeah?
With the model I talked about, or with Turntable Falls, the model, yeah, and that's the challenge is, it would have to be people with some form of employment. And the question is, for land trusts, is when you buy the land. I mean, that's the core point of it. If you can buy the land at a cheap price, you've got a big advantage. And that's the hard thing we have in this giant bubble now. It was interesting to hear that Detroit was investing a lot of money in land trusts following the financial crisis, where I saw some figures that showed that it was just a 7% foreclosure rate amongst community land trust members compared to the wider community. So governments are looking at what's happening in this space, but I'm seeing some people not agreeing. Maybe that was just a Chinese whisper I read.
Yeah.
The information on the pension funds investing in land trust is intriguing, because there's a huge need among seniors. There's some groups that have been meeting that are desperate to find places that are affordable on fixed income, or especially if they've lost everything that they had saved, and also to be able to live in community. Some sort of independence, and yet some sort of care, or combining resources in one location where you could share resources, whether it's rides or caretaking. So this is a very intriguing thing, to try to approach pension funds to invest in land trusts, because ultimately they're most likely to benefit those people as they hit pension age.
Absolutely, and when you see the volatility that happens in the economy, so much of it is tied to real estate speculation, and the more that we put a dampener on that, the better it is for these pension funds in terms of the risk they're taking by investing so many billions of dollars. And I agree, this sharing economy, the collaborative economy, is doing such a great job in terms of helping new networks establish connections, but underpinning it all is a place to call home. And it's just devastating to see these 100 Google buses and the rents that follow those high incomes, that is just steamrolling, Haight Street and the lower Haight and around, all through Oakland, and goodness me, 21% increase in rents here in Oakland over the last year. So who can keep up with that? It's crazy, but you're right, there's got to be a better synergy with these huge lump sum savings that are out there.
Well, a senior assisted living is astronomically expensive. So even for the people who had good jobs or had good pensions, it's all going to go back when they need some sort of care in an assisted community kind of space that's traditional, the way it's set up now. Whereas if people are living in
how are the costs for nursing homes here in America? I know in Australia, you basically, the kid's inheritance is now gone because you need to put $400,000 down to get a bed, and then you're paying $15,000 to $20,000. And my half of my family's from New Zealand, and there my grandma had Alzheimer's for a good 15 years, and we said, look, can you please let her die in peace? They kept on giving her that shot to keep her going so they can keep that 20K rolling through each year. So yeah, it's a nasty
$4,400 a month here, and that's if the senior citizen is ambulatory and doesn't need a lot of help.
So that's 60K, and is there a deposit to get in there?
Yes.
Goodness.
Yeah, I know Betsy has been.
No, I'll speak later.
Okay, sure.
Hi,
Maybe say your name.
Donna.
Donna, thanks.
Yeah. Hi. I'm interested in what you were saying about vacant land and abandoned properties and what you all did with that. I'm also curious about using land trusts and so forth to help for people who are facing Ellis Act evictions and other kinds of, other evictions as well. I know that a bit of that has gone on, and I don't know if any of you know anything about that, but could you speak to all three of those topics?
Those are big, juicy ones. I know there was an attempted piece of legislation to stop Ellis Act evictions, which did not go through this year. I'm not actually familiar of any land trusts that are actively working in that space.
There was a co-op formed as a result of an Ellis Act eviction in the Mission
Right.
earlier.
Yeah, Betsy, do you have
It
some?
might be helpful to know. Betsy Morris. I'm a co-host of East Bay Co-Housing, and also here to shamelessly promote an event, an unconference happening Saturday where 2 and maybe even all 3 of you will be present, and a number of you in the audience, so if I can pass it around. I just want to say we have 5 community land trusts in the Bay Area going back 45 years or more. And it's a really interesting conversation to be had between the theory of what they might be doing and the reality of just the financial stranglehold, and also 40 years of people in the Bay Area feeling like, 1, we don't really want more housing here if you're already here, or 2, we want our little private piece of property because it looked like that's how you bankrolled retirement, right? If you got any land, you could eventually sell it and that would bankroll retirement. So these alternatives are ways to have I'm just a big fan. There's a lot of reasons why they're a really important part of creating more intentional communities as well as just stable neighborhoods. And there's some examples from around the country that I think are useful that we'll be presenting as well. Dudley Street Initiative in Boston is famous as the only community initiative that got the power of eminent domain over 1,300 parcels and 60 acres of land in this neighborhood 22 miles from downtown Boston. So, and here in the Bay Area, we've also had other kinds of large 100 acre, multi-hundreds of units of housing cooperatives that were built here in the 60s. And they're like teetering. They're teetering on the bank because they never had enough money to do their repairs. They're not democratic. Their residents are struggling to figure out, you mean we own this? So that's why this unconference is about how to reclaim the commons that we already have through the land trusts and these potentially in cooperation with these co-ops, and basically tap the union pension funds here. There's an AFL-CIO land investment fund back east. There's a bunch of things we could start to tap for those of us who can think a little bit ahead of, hey, I need my cheap place to live now, all sympathy to that. But we're not going to change it without a consciousness of what those larger possibilities already existing, and how could we revitalize them. So forgive me the shameless pitch, but I want to invite everybody to the unconference on Saturday.
Yeah, that's a great opportunity to engage with these questions for a full day. And Betsy's been an amazing organizer around co-housing and housing cooperatives in the Bay Area for many, many, many years. So I'm definitely excited to be there. You'll be there as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Had an invitation, but we didn't pester you hard enough.
Thank you. I'm going to be driving to Sundance ceremony in Wyoming. Wow.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, the vacancies. So what are we doing about it? We're trying to get our Australian Bureau of Statistics to take over the measurement of it to give a greater authenticity, because a lot of people don't believe there's so many vacant properties around. But as soon as, it's often a conversation I have with someone and they'll say, that's rubbish. There's no way there's 60,000 empty properties in Melbourne. And I'll see them a couple of years later and I go, I've never thought about it, but I see that one empty apartment in my block of flats, and then when I go over to Joe's house, guess what? There's another one. And they add up, these vacant properties, and the thing being here in such a tech hotspot, I'm just hoping the synchronicities deliver me a beautiful app designer who can start to build the geospatial apps we need, so we can really be keeping an eye on what's happening with these vacant properties. And wouldn't it be good if they all came up, with some sort of red color, and maybe they'd start off at a different color and then they'd get up to red the longer they've been vacant, and we could be showing how much money they're making each year compared to how much the students are paying in student fees each year. And you'll often see a lot of these vacant properties surrounding the universities. And so in 2010 I released a film, an indie film called Real Estate for Ransom. So real estate with the number 4, ransom.com, and it talks about a lot of these issues. But I'm here to speak at 3 or 4 different conferences and so forth, but also to film up a storm, because I'm just gutted that 5 years after the GFC we've got this global property bubble storming ahead so fast. And one of the most beautiful examples of monopoly power I've seen is University of California, Irvine. And the Irvine family owning that whole university, having not sold any of the land, and it's a reverse community land trust. Here's a family, got the land, they're increasing the rents, and every year that is guaranteed virtually to go up. And it hardly dropped over the GFC period, what we call a global financial crisis in Australia. But this family is making an absolute fortune. And what made me even more frustrated was that they own, from what I understand, the actual whole suburb of Irvine. So outside of the university, they also own that land. And they have, in Australia, we call it demand assessment. And I call it real estate for ransom. But they basically won't sell that land until there's more buyers than what they're willing to release. So that keeps the prices going up and up and up. And there's no pressure on them to release that land, to release these hostages. And so the vacancy rate, doctoring that is one effective mechanism. Hiding the land values and how much they're going up is another effective one. And here in America, they do that by overvaluing the buildings and undervaluing the land. And Goldman Sachs actually had a blacklist for any of the old school property appraisers who would recognize that it was the land and the location that was so valuable. And they wouldn't hire them. So they'd only hire the guys who would bump the building price up. Guess why? Depreciation. They can write the depreciation off more and more. So it's a beautiful set of figures for those who have got money, isn't it?
Are you involved with 3000acres.org?
No, that's interesting, isn't it? So give us an overview of them.
I mean, the way I understand is 3000acres.org works in Melbourne, Australia, and they do exactly what you said. They have a online application that maps out all the vacant land and abandoned properties, color codes it depending on whether someone has checked it out already, or it's just known about, or it's in the process of becoming a garden, or it seems like all ready for someone to take it on and start turning it into a community garden.
Yeah, but I know they do things along those lines, but the problem is when you set up a community garden, everyone wants to go there for lunch or go and hang out and enjoy these beautiful surroundings. So what does that do to the community land values? These permaculturalists like myself, I was today at Please Touch My Garden opposite on Grover Street. Helped get the compost fired up there for a little while and took some great footage. So close to City Hall, and there's his vacant block. But there were city workers in there having lunch, watching us work, and this is fantastic for all the local landlords. Mm-hmm. We, the public, are working for the surrounding landlords because this economic function has been removed from the teaching. So that's why I'm so happy to see that at least here in California, you guys are catching on to that stuff again. Because in Australia, no one's got a clue.
Well, that's a massive issue here in Oakland of urban greening and gentrification. The exact same dynamic, which is particularly visceral in North Oakland, where there's a really active food justice group, Fat Beats, who runs a number of community gardens there, and a local real estate agent started advertising the homes by using these community gardens that were very explicitly there for, historic residents to grow healthy food, particularly for marginalized communities. And they launched a really strong attack against the real estate agency, saying like, no, you will not basically exploit this work to raise the value of properties. But it's still happening. So it's definitely a problem. Yeah.
There's another issue right now which is really pertinent and interesting. I wonder what you think about it. There's a bill that passed the state senate that is up to the city of Oakland to adopt, which it has not yet, called the Urban Agriculture Incentive Zones Act, which would essentially reduce property owners' property taxes in exchange for rezoning the land agricultural use, making it available to, I'm not clear about exactly how they intend to make it available, but that's the idea for urban agricultural use. But developers have said that they would snatch up property in that case because then they could sit on it with almost no property taxes for the allotted period, which is 10 years. So it's quite a tricky thing. Which is more worthwhile, the 10 years that we could have right now with lots of land and what we can build out of it, but with the caveat that, it will all be speculated upon immediately at the end of that period.
Yeah, and who's going to want to have their land rezoned down from residential? We call it the golden pentic when it goes from farmland to residential on the edge of a city. And bang, the land values go up by hundreds of thousands of dollars per acre. So I don't know, it's got good intentions, this line of thinking, but it's hard because I'm kind of getting the feeling that people actually, we used to run we did this thing called speed renting. Instead of speed dating, it was speed renting. So you'd have a spare room and you'd want to meet someone outside of your own circle. You might have lost a few friends in your co-housing sort of situation, but it's always nice to meet new people. And it was fascinating to see these interactions going on. But it's a frustrating world.
Did you have your? Yeah.
Betsy
did. Yeah.
I just wanna
Yeah. What, you haven't spoken yet? Why not?
It was more, Hank might or may not. I didn't know how, in terms of speculation, what the Indigenous First Nations community might kind of have as a way of reclaiming and because this thing is like, speculation gets everything, and our government is not about to say, okay, here's land for trust or land for housing. Is there any avenues that you know of? I feel like there might have been some wins in Canada recently that, you know, it's been like, okay, you can't, like, yeah, I don't know if that question is clear in terms of how this relates.
Well, I can say that in New York State, the Oneida people sued to reclaim the land that had been given to them by treaty, but then the treaties got ignored and the land was sold to settlers. That's code for white people. And so the Oneida sued, I think the Cayuga might have sued also, and it went to the Supreme Court and they won their suit. So the land, and then, so there's been lots of back and forth and New York State's involved. The goal, I think, at this point is not to take land from people who, quote, own the property, but to eventually let that land revert back to native ownership, or the native people will buy it. I don't know which of those solutions will be used. But it raises, I mean, I guess there's a whole legal issue around the reclaiming of native lands. And this is interesting because I'm involved with the Gill Tract Farm Coalition and Occupy the Farm and the Gill Tract in Berkeley. And, you know, there was this conference in Berkeley recently called Our Land, sponsored by the Agrarian Trust, to promote the availability and access to land for young farmers. That's also code. But it's not their land. If anybody can say it's our land, I can say that. Of course it's not, because there's a whole history now of English law that brought, you know, property law that got imported to the United States, and the land was taken and divided and parceled out to landowners using a property law. It's interesting that, and I'm glad you asked that question because I wanted to get back to this point. This whole issue is racialized in significant and severe ways. You know, you mentioned about pension funds. So I have a land trust. I'd love to get a pension fund to come up to me and say, hey, we're going to give you $10 million to acquire farmland, to lease to low-income farmers of color to start farms. Except that's never going to happen because I don't look like them. They don't give money to people like me. They give money to white people. There's a whole analysis starting with folks in Detroit, Malik Yakini and the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, about how this whole set of issues in my case, I'm interested in food access, is dominated by white people. The money's dominated by white people. And I would like us to figure out, maybe SELC can help us out, to figure out a way to press a land claim against the University of California for taking native land, and using that as one of the leverage points for getting the Gill Tract to be as an entire 20 acres of land that's devoted to sustainable agriculture. We'll see about that. But the point is, getting native land back is going to be a struggle. The first land trusts were formed actually in the South by African American people who were finding ways to resist the taking of African American lands, farmland, and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is a successor to that whole movement. So the first cooperatives in the U.S. were for that purpose of preserving land, but for people of color, it's a sad history in the United States, and it's hard to talk about, and people don't want to talk about it. So, you know, no one will talk to me after this, after I've made these comments, you see.
No, it was on my chart.
Oh, okay, cool.
You just couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Hank, how did Native Americans used to share the bounty of the land? What was the traditional way you used to do that?
Well, you know, each group occupied a particular space, and they manage that space for themselves. Actually, that's also, not to jump from mainland US to Hawaii, but I was just reading an article, it was in, I guess, an Earth Island Journal about land tenure in Hawaii, and there used to be a land subdivision based on the way streams came out of the mountains and ran down to the ocean, and the land was managed by the people who lived on this like sector, and everything they needed to survive was in that sector, including the part of the ocean that the river ran into where they could fish. And how that got destroyed by colonial systems of plantation development. And the people are trying to restore that system now in Hawaii. But this area, if you look at a map of Ohlone people around the Bay Area, there were lots and lots of different groups, small bands of people who lived and had their own little area and lived off the land. As a matter of fact, one of my first memories was in the 4th grade. How many of you went to grammar school in California and had the what do they call it? The unit on mission Indians, the missions and the mission Indians. And at that time, I did not have conscious knowledge of my heritage, but when the teacher talked about the Digger Indians, there was a chill that went up and down my spine that I know is built into my DNA and into my consciousness somehow. And you know, the history didn't say that our people were enslaved by the Jesuits, and doesn't say that in 1852 the state of California, the new state of California, passed a law that paid civilian militia to kill native people for a bounty. And the genocide that went on in California was massive. I mean, there's just parts of our history that are extremely painful to talk about. So how we get the land back, I don't know. How we restore those original systems of living simply on the land, taking the bounty of the land itself. I'm very fortunate. I have just started a farm myself in the Pinole area, and we're just beginning at the beginning of the process. But as I walk that land every day, the land speaks to me and teaches me. And it's one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. And I cherish that experience. And I know that if I keep listening, that small little piece of land will teach me how to nurture not only myself, but the people I am engaged with and other people in our community who need access to fresh, healthy, affordable food. So you've asked a question that I really can't answer. How do we get it back? And how did we manage it before? But I know we did. And we can again if we have the will, and somehow we crack through these barriers of race and class that now divide us so horribly.
I know what you're saying. It's hard, and this is the battle I have with my executive, is they want me to stay focused on the systemic issue of reforming this economic system and taxing away these speculators so that the prices fall back to the reality of our wages. But the property bubble was all about finding the next sucker to sell to, and that's what's going on. And we've got capital coming in from China, from Norway, from Australia. God, there's so many Australian developers here in America buying up your land dirt cheap and having a ball, and they're bragging about it in Australia. We've got all these how to invest in America type forums going on, and it's accelerating at a rate of knots. But I don't see a great escalation of people's interest in trying to understand those systemic issues. I wish there was. I wish I had hundreds of emails from people saying, I saw your film, there's only 3 or 4 films on real estate out there, and you've blown my mind. I get one every couple of months, maybe. But you know, we need to get this snowball of people really concerned about it, and community land trust is a micro version of the systemic change we want. And the problem we have is because the statistics have been doctored around the world, they've basically told and conned economists into believing this is not possible. And so we need to show them that land trusts can be financially viable and sustainable for a long period of time. And being here at the Sustainable Economies Law Centre, we haven't actually talked about the charter of the articles of interest and how you set up a land trust. And I'm no expert in this, but I know that one of the oldest trusts in America was in Fairhope, Alabama, and it was set up on the edge of the town, beautiful farmland. Fast forward 70, 80 years, and the third generation is still living there, and they're surrounded by suburbs, realizing they're on a gold mine. And so within the last 10 years or so, they sold up, all made a fortune, because the articles of interest setting up the trust were not established to say that this primary purpose of this trust is to provide more and more affordable housing. And backing that up, we're going to have a solid economic system which has yearly land valuations and some form of land rent payment back to the trust so they can be sustainable and expand their affordable housing base. So I know it must be so frustrating for you, and I'm trying to find a comedian who can make this actually understandable for everyday people, because it's pretty dry, this sort of discussion, but it's vital. Well, to be a custodian of the land, you have to have that connection, and it has to be based on reality. And unfortunately, our system at the moment is based on this exchanging of properties, but paying a land rent should be related. That rent, by economist standards, is based on what the local earning capacity is for that community. So that's effectively how the rents are decided. But in Turntable Falls, paying $1,200 a year, and many of those people there have foraged and built their own houses. So it's not an exclusive community at all. A lot of people are outside the system, big time. And David, he's got, I think, 100 fruit trees of his own, and a huge garden. And so they are using this land productively. That's what I like. But the land rent model I'm talking about, and the danger, it's not an easy topic, this. And part of the problem you have in Australia, we have this 80-20 rule, which JJ was kind of talking about, where 20% has to be for affordable housing. What happens is those developers take that discount from that 20% they're giving and lump it on the other 80% of homes. So it just pushes the problem elsewhere. So what I'm hoping is that if we did have this land trust model that's part land rent, part capital gains tax, it would start off with people who are probably lower income earners, but they've still got a reasonable wage. But over time, as this land trust builds and it's got the support of the superannuation industry who see they can repay their funds, it would expand even on its own base, and from that it would help provide the supply we need for affordable housing. And the problem we have all around the world is that the capital gains are so great in penthouses and luxury apartments, is that that's what they build. So until we get to the systemic issue of changing this tax system, it's going to continue getting harder and harder for us. And I often say on my radio show, when on earth is the pain of an empty wallet on a Friday night when you're dying to have a beer with your friends going to be more than actually sitting down and understanding the economics and the tax system behind it? So that's what we're waiting for, and the Georgist movement has been saying this for 140 odd years almost, and the story goes back thousands of years before George. There's examples of the Javanese in Indonesia having their ways of sharing the bounty. And in Australia, there's just been rampant genocide where Indigenous people are dying 20 years younger than us Gubba folk. And they have hung on to a few stories, and one of them is how they used to cut up the bounty, basically a kangaroo or whatever that they came in with hunting wise, and they would have a system of sharing that meat so that every family got a share of it. And that's the sort of principle we need to return to. And taxation, I often say, is white man's word for sharing. And it's unfortunate it's been so badly bastardized by the system of lobbying and lobbyocracy, but somehow or other we're going to have to get back to really caring about this economics and this tax system, because money is the fastest form of information in terms of finding ways to exchange goods. It's not perfect, but at least it's something. And there's a whole different discussion there on reforming the monetary system, I know, but
you want to Hank, final words maybe?
Well, it's like
for today.
I keep learning so much from Carl with his economic analysis. So it's like I'll try to keep learning. And I think I actually did see your film. I looked. I think you sent me a link, and
it's worth watching.
Yeah. But this whole conversation, I think, at its base hinges on values and value systems. So that the kinds of economic issues that Carl's talking about depend on the maintenance of the current economic system that we have, without putting labels on what kind of economic system we have. And the idyllic, utopian, romantic, unrealistic view that I have doesn't have that system at its heart or at its core. I think that really, since land is beyond estimable value, really, it has no value. And I think as an ethical value, we have to recognize that and insist that we can't trade on it. And insist that when someone is homeless and needs housing, we find as a culture and as a society a way to create that housing, not in 10 years, and not waiting for very wealthy people to do it, but because we're going to do it right now.
Yeah, for sure.
But those are values and an approach to ethical values that have very little weight in our current system. I mean, it's chilling to me. I could say it's funny, ironic, ha ha ha, but it's chilling to me to hear that Australian investors go back to Australia and laugh about investing in America. I mean, I don't care if they want to exploit America in some basic way. Who gives a shit? Pardon my French. However, it's not funny that people are exploiting, not us as a country, I'm not talking about patriotism, the people are exploiting each other in this way, and there's only a few people who can do it. You know, other words come to my mind that I won't use. Words that start with F, for example. But at what point do we stand up? And I've been thinking about this for a while. I was lucky enough to go to the Basque region to do a food sovereignty tour in March, and witnessed and experienced there something that I call cooperative culture. A way of people standing together to make sure everybody has enough of what they need. When are we in this country and other countries like this country going to stand up, wake up and stand up and say, we're not doing this anymore? We're just not going to do it. We don't have to. But, you know, I'm unrealistic.
So it's after 7:30. Clearly this conversation doesn't end here, but we do need to close this particular constellation. So I want to encourage people to make some connections as we're beginning to wrap it up. And just to note that clearly there's cultural interventions that need to take place, there's economic interventions, there's political interventions. And, you know, it's a movement, right? We're talking about movement building and healing. I think really this is about healing. So we open this conversation as the beginning of something because SELC as an organization is really exploring how do we get involved with a particular legal lens? Where's our intervention that serves this larger healing? And there's a lot of other people and organizations doing this work at different scales and at different points in the system. So just to add that it's not an either or necessarily to me, but a both and, that we really need to be working at all levels, at all points that we can. So just a note, like, as I mentioned at the beginning, that this was sort of a response to another community forum that happened here in Oakland that was hosted by the Economic Development Without Displacement Coalition, which SELC is a part of, but that's a multiracial, multi-organizational coalition of people who are exploring these issues. So if any of you would like to become involved in that, we're exploring many different ways of addressing this issue, particularly in North Oakland. And community land trusts are one. So we've been in conversation with the Oakland Community Land Trust, not just about housing, but for food production and for local business preservation, so that we actually do build wealth that stays in the community that is owned by the historic residents and the existing businesses that are at risk of being displaced. So there's a Facebook group for that, Economic Development Without Displacement. That's just another way to get involved. So just so you all know that the conversation continues in different places. So with that, I'm sure there's so much more to be said, but I really want to thank everyone for coming and for listening and speaking respectfully, and to both of you who've come from different places to share your work. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you to JJ for